The soldiers sounded happy that the war in Europe was over, but they knew their work was not done, as the war with Japan was still raging, and many would soon be sent to duty there after a short respite at home. WHO's Jack Shelley had a similar experience. Soon after returning from Europe in the spring of 1945, Shelley applied for accreditation with the U.S. Navy to cover the war in the Pacific. And by July, he was on the island of Guam, the only local radio station correspondent in America to report on both the European and Pacific theaters. Jack Shelley says the two biggest stories he ever covered soon followed. Shelley was on the island of Guam when the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he obtained the first recorded interview with the crews of the planes, including the pilot of the Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets.
And I have said it so many, many times that with all the importance and all the horror implied by the dropping of an atomic bomb, the matter of fact, the calm, level way in which Colonel Tibbets addressed his responses to my question reminded me later on of the same kind of talk, the same level of calm, the same feeling of I've got a job and I have done it and this is how it was done, that the people who landed on the moon told you, that the astronauts have done. These are people who practice a very, very highly skilled technological kind of job, and they view it in terms of performing a function. And they don't, until perhaps much later, if ever, think about some of the more emotional and some of the more judgmental aspects of what they're doing.
This is Jack Shelley on Guam. The wire recording you are about to hear was made at a B-29 base somewhere in the Marianas, where I attended one of the most absorbing press conferences of the Pacific War. In a large conference room, crew members of the planes which dropped atomic bombs in the first two missions over Japan, and the scientists who took part in the development and research making those weapons possible, told their stories. Immediately after the conference, I was able to record the voices of a number of those men. The first man I talked to was the commander of the plane that dropped the first of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Japan. He is Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr. of Miami, Florida. But a few minutes after I met him, I discovered that he lived for a number of years in Des Moines and attended school there. Furthermore, the very plane which he piloted over Hiroshima and the other B-29 that dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, both these planes were built by the Martin Bomber Plant at Omaha, Nebraska. Colonel Tibbets said that in that history-making first use of the atomic bomb in actual warfare over Hiroshima, his experience was hardly different from ordinary flying, up until the time the bomb had been released, and he had seen no fighters or anti-aircraft fire. But immediately after the bomb was released and the explosion occurred, he said, the sight that greeted his eyes was hard to believe. Then I asked Colonel Tibbet what it looked like.
Well, coming up on the bomb run, the city was visible to us. Our aiming point, the military headquarters there, stood out very clearly. After the bomb had exploded, and by the time we could turn around and get a look at it, the city was a mass of dust.
And what was the effect on your airplane itself when that terrific blast let go?
To me, it appeared that it was exactly the same as anti-aircraft fire. As a matter of fact, I was fooled, even though I was expecting a reaction to the airplane from the blast. When it did happen, my first reaction was that it was black.
This was done with the wire recorder. Flew back to Guam, went to the Navy radio headquarters on Guam, turned over a technician, and one of the things about a wire recorder, those thin strands of wire were strung over a magnetic head between two reels, and of course it was done like you would record on a tape, except you did it on a very thin strand of wire. If that wire broke, you were in terrible trouble because the tension was such that the wire just spewed out in all directions, and you had an almost irretrievable mess on your hands. Well, I turned this over to the technician and sat down there, probably started to write my needed copy, and he came out and said, Jack, I think we've lost it. He said, the tape broke. And he brought it out there and showed me the mess, and I wanted to kill him first of all, although it wasn't his fault. And then I said, well, let's just whack off what that mess is to see what we got left. And by golly, I had been such a blabbermouth that I'd been talking about all kinds of stuff before we got the interview. and a clean start, and all the rest of it was saved, which was wonderful.
Soon after the atomic bombs were dropped, on September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered, and the war was over. Jack Shelley held a prime seat to view it all.
Go ahead, Guam. Go ahead, Guam. Go ahead, Guam. Go ahead.
This is Jack Shelley on the command ship Ancon in Tokyo Bay, Japan. At 8:42, we get word that General MacArthur is coming aboard from a destroyer on the other side. At 8:52 a.m., the Japanese delegation of 11 men arrives alongside. The 3 civilians and 8 military men have been bouncing around in a small, very unelaborate boat farther out for quite a while. As they come up the steps to the quarterdeck, you see their leader, Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, has a right leg that's almost useless. Apparently, it's an artificial limb. The NIP delegation lines up alone in 3 rows, standing stiffly while the cameras grind and flash. Then, exactly at 9 o'clock, General MacArthur appears so suddenly and quietly that you miss it until he starts talking. His hand holding the script is trembling noticeably, apparently with emotion, but his voice is firm. Then he tells the Jap delegation to sign.
And the end of that Japanese surrender was such a perfect climax. The Japanese had been brought out to the Missouri in a rather beat-up old boat. The admirals had fancy-looking barges and so forth when they came, the American admirals. But the Japanese were brought in a pretty grungy-looking boat to the side and then came up on the main deck. And they departed after the surrender, started to go down the ladder and get into their boat to go back to tell Hirohito they'd signed the surrender. And just at that climactic moment, as the surrender was over, there suddenly began to be the sound of airplane motors. And hundreds of American airplanes, both Navy and Army Air Force planes, started flying in formation over the Missouri in a steady formation, just pouring down the cascade of sound. And they almost shook the decks of that powerful warship, so great was the sound that was coming down from overhead. And as they left that defeated group of Japanese, this tremendous reverberation of sound was reminding them, you've signed a surrender. You've lost a war. Don't forget that. And it was a real period to the end of probably the most historic event that I think I've ever watched.
The reports that Shelley and Plambeck sent back were done via shortwave radio to the United States. They were occasionally aired live, but more often than not they were recorded for later playback. And in those days before audio tape, that meant cutting a record, a glass-based, wax-covered platter. The communication, therefore, went only one way. Often the reporters would talk before the actual recording so the engineers on each end could test the shortwave signal. And sometimes that talk-up included messages for the folks back at the network or the radio station in Des Moines. Here now some examples that have never been heard publicly before.
Hello, NBC. This is Jack Shelley of WHO.
Right on.
I'm ready to go ahead with one recording about 9 minutes long for Air Express, as usual, to the newsroom, radio station WHO Des Moines. Anytime you say the word NBC, we're set here.
You can go ahead anytime.
Okay, we'll start this interview, 9 minutes in duration, in 10 seconds from now.
You can send over some cold milk and some ice cream just any time. And by the way, you have some barbers ready when I get back. I haven't had a haircut now in 7 weeks. I won't tell you how long it's been since I've had a bath. And I am definitely down to my very, very last shirt, my very, very last pair of socks. I've lost all the others somewhere in the half-dozen moves we've made recently, or lost them to somewhere.
Okay, NBC, that winds it up. How was the signal?
NBC to Shelley. The signal received okay.
Fine. Thanks a lot, fellas.
Right on.
I'll be seeing you from Paris one of these days.
Looking forward to it.